is Steve Laffey's Fixing America. And now, broadcasting live from the Fixing America Command Center in Fort Collins, Colorado, here is your host, Steve Laffey.
Steve Laffey here. Thanks for joining us today. Steve Laffey's Fixing America. Today we have a special tribute to Martin Luther King. It's January 15th, 2014. And Martin Luther King, who was born on January 15th, one of the great civil rights leaders, the greatest civil rights leader of our time, a man who at the time was the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize back when it mattered if you won. And the struggles, whether it was in Selma or Montgomery or Birmingham, and just a great icon of the 20th century. So we thought we'd take the time here today at LaffeyRadio.com to play some of his speeches and speeches by others about him. And I won't talk much today. So, in fact, we're going to start off quickly because we have a lot of clips to get through. But a man long admired, a national holiday made for him in 1983. And I think even now it's time for our younger people to rediscover the struggles that so many of these people went through from the 50s, from Brown versus Board of Education, all the way through, well, to today, but to the assassination of Martin Luther King, that time period of violence. And someone like Martin Luther King who preached nonviolence. And did so well, who stirred up the whole country. And we'll talk about some of the other people, too, who came along with him, because it's not just about Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King's birthday. It's not all we celebrate. We celebrate the hundreds and thousands of others that we don't know their names of, Jimmy Lee Jackson and so forth, others who suffered mightily through that struggling time for blacks to get equal access, to be able to vote, to be able to go to college and so forth. So let's start with his most famous speech. We will run out of time if we don't. It's I Have a Dream speech, a very famous one, August 28th, 1963, Washington, D.C.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. Yeah. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. A dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
There he is, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech. And we're going to head right into another speech right now. And just remember, sometimes in between speeches, here's a man, Martin Luther King, January 30th, 1956. His home was bombed. He was at a Baptist church, his Baptist church. He came running home. There's 300 angry black men and women, hoes and guns. And he says to them, don't commit violence. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Here he is on Meet the Press in 1965. Special tribute to Martin Luther King today.
Our guest today on Meet the Press is Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who is in San Francisco. On our panel of reporters in Washington, D.C., you have just met Lawrence Spivak. Our other reporters today are Tom Wickert of the New York Times, James J. Kilpatrick of the Richmond News Leader, and John Chancellor of NBC News. We'll continue the questions now with Mr. Wicker.
Dr. King, you said a moment ago that Alabama was a state that gives respectability to the resistance and defiance of the law. And you listed an observance of the law by local agencies in the South as one of the cardinal aims that you were seeking. Yet on March the 9th, you led the second march on Montgomery in violation of a federal injunction not to march. You said that order was unjust. And John Lewis, one of your colleagues, said that the Negroes had a constitutional right to march, injunction or no injunction. Now, was that in keeping with the spirit of nonviolence and the restraint that has always characterized your movement? And could you explain your reasoning in defying the court order that day?
Well, let me say two things to that, Mr. Wicker. First, I did not consider myself defying a court order that particular day. I consulted with my attorneys before the march, and they stated that they felt that it was an invalid order and that it would not be, that I would not be in contempt of court violating the court order if I led the march to the point of having a moral confrontation with the state troopers at the point where the people were brutalized on Sunday. So I still don't consider that breaking a court order or breaking what I consider an unjust law. On the other hand, I must be honest enough to say that I do feel that there are two types of laws. One is a just law and one is an unjust law. I think we all have moral obligations to obey just laws. On the other hand, I think we have moral obligations to disobey unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. I think the distinction here is that when one breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, he must do it openly, he must do it cheerfully, he must do it lovingly, he must do it civilly, not uncivilly, and he must do it with a willingness to accept the penalty. And any man who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail in order to arouse the conscience of the community on the injustice of the law is at that moment expressing the very highest respect for law.
Well, I can sympathize with a good deal of that, but it seems to me you get into a very difficult point here at which one man's conscience is set, in fact, above the conscience of society, which has invoked the law. How are we to enforce law when a doctrine is preached that one man's conscience may tell him that the law is unjust when other men's conscience don't tell them that?
And I think you enforce it, and I think you deal with it by not allowing anarchy to develop. I do not believe in defying the law, as many of the segregationists do. I do not believe in evading the law, as many of the segregationists do. The fact is that most of the segregationists and racists that I see are not willing to suffer enough for their beliefs in segregation, and they are not willing to go to jail. I think the chief norm for guiding the situation is the willingness to accept the penalty. And I don't think any society can call an individual irresponsible who breaks a law and willingly accepts the penalty if conscience tells him that that law is unjust. And I think that this is a long tradition in our society. It's a long tradition in biblical history. Meshach and Abednego broke an unjust law, and they did it because they had to be true to a higher moral law. The early Christians practiced civil disobedience in a superb manner. Academic freedom would not be a reality today if it had not been for Socrates, and if it had not been for Socrates' willingness to practice civil disobedience. And I would say that in our own history, there's nothing that expresses massive civil disobedience any more than the Boston Tea Party, and yet we give this to our young people and our students as a part of the great tradition of our nation. So I think we're in good company when we break unjust laws, and I think those who are willing to do it and accept the penalty are those who are part of the saving of the nation.
Wow, a great lesson for today, and some of the people who think they're practicing civil disobedience, but really aren't, because they don't accept their penalties willingly. What a wise man. Steve Laffey, SteveLaffey, radio.com at Fixing It. We're playing here a Martin Luther King Tribute Day, and just played a couple of speeches by him, one interview on Meet the Press. We'll take a quick break here and come back and play a couple more of his speeches and talk about a couple of the instances that happened, all of the many, the 20 times he was arrested, the threats to his life, and so forth. But Martin Luther King, a special man for a special time. Steve Laffey, Steve Laffey Radio will be right back.
Stay tuned. Steve Laffey's Fixing America returns after these commercial messages.
Picture this, your next trip, Utah, 5 national parks. First, Zion. You're walking, the ground rises, the ground drops, the ground becomes water. Next, Bryce. You're riding a mule. You're riding a mule under giant orange strip castles. You are not dreaming. You will not forget this. On to Capitol Reef. Take the scenic route, the really scenic route. Take a path you've never taken and see the stars for the first time. Now for Canyonlands. You're riding a bike. You're riding a bike on Mars. Now you're riding the rapids. Class 2, Class 3, Class 4, Classic. Arches, 5:32 a.m. Some things are worth racing the sunrise for. The horizon lightens. You round the corner. Whoa. This is Life Elevated. The Mighty 5. 5 iconic parks, 1 epic experience. Plan your trip at visitutah.com.
I'm always up for a challenge. It's the feeling of accomplishment that drives me. And there's no better challenge than serving part-time in the Coast Guard Reserve. I protect my country, work with the best and brightest. I get great pay and benefits in return. The Coast Guard Reserve is important work. I get to serve my community, and it's always rewarding.
If you were born ready, there's a new challenge waiting for you. Learn about serving part-time at gocoastguard.com/reserve.
This is Nnamdi Asamoah. I play football for the Philadelphia Eagles, but what I do off the field with United Way might be more important. I'm a volunteer tutor and mentor. Why? Because over 1 million kids a year drop out of school, and that's not okay. It takes 12 years to create a graduate, but it takes about the same time to create a dropout. And the difference between a child becoming one or the other could be me, or it could be you. Studies show that if we get to these kids earlier, their chances are better. And kids who read well by 3rd grade are more likely to graduate. So join me in United Way. Suit up and take the pledge. Become a volunteer reader, tutor, or mentor. Because when a child succeeds, we all succeed. Give, advocate, volunteer, live united. Take the pledge at unitedway.org. Brought to you by United Way, the Ad Council, and the National Football League.
And now, back to the Fixing America radio program with your host, Steve Laffey.
A time comes when silence is betrayal, even when pressed by the demands of inner truth. Men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world.
Steve Laffey here. Steve Laffey's Fixing America. Thanks for joining us January 15, 2014, as we celebrate the life of Martin Luther King, the great civil rights leader who preached nonviolence. Many of you know some of the famous speech we've already played, but you won't know some of the, as Louis Freeh, my friend, says, the B tape. Go looking back into the albums and getting some thoughts from Martin Luther King that can be pertinent to our life as we celebrate today. I know on Monday next week they'll actually celebrate his birthday, but we decided to do it here on his birthday, January 15, 2014. And before I get to the next speech, it's important, I think, to bring up the movement. I kind of went through reading about people, and I just took a city of St. Augustine, the oldest city in America, and you look at a lady like Georgia Reed, who won't make the history books. You almost can't find her, even if you Google. But a lady that was an older lady, when people didn't want to march, so many had been beaten up by police. The sit-ins that happened in St. Augustine, it's the only city where Martin Luther King in Florida was arrested, of the 20 times he was arrested. And finally, when no one would go, the story goes that Georgia Reed, an older black lady who had polio, or I forget what disease she had, but she was not in good health. She said, "Take me home. Let me put on some good clothes. When I get arrested, I want to be dressed well when I go to jail." I mean, that kind of bravery that we talk about Martin Luther King, but it's not just Martin Luther King. It's all these people who were brave, who went down there and in a nonviolent way brought civil rights and brought the Voting Rights Act and so forth. But let's play another speech. This is the speech of why Jesus called a wise man a fool speech. It's August 27th, 1967 at Mount Pisgah Baptist Church, Martin Luther King. Thanks for listening.
Then we started our struggle together. Things were going well for the first few days, but then about 10 or 15 days later, after the white people in Montgomery knew that we meant business, they started doing some nasty things. They started making nasty telephone calls, and came to the point that some days more than 40 telephone calls would come in, threatening my life, the life of my family, the life of my children. I took it for a while in a strong manner, Yeah.
But I never will forget one night very late. It was around midnight. And you can have some strange experiences at midnight. I had been out meeting with the steering committee all that night. And I came home.
Lord help.
My wife was in the bed, and I immediately crawled into bed to get some rest, to get up early the next morning to try to keep things going. And immediately the telephone started ringing, and I picked it up. On the other end was an ugly voice. That voice said to me in substance, "Nigger, we're tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're gonna blow your brains out and blow up your house."
Lord Jesus.
I'd heard these things before, but for some reason that night it got to me. I turned over and I tried to go to sleep, but I couldn't sleep.
Yeah. Lord Jesus.
I was frustrated, bewildered. And then I got up and went back to the kitchen, and I started warming some coffee, thinking that coffee would give me a little relief. And then I started thinking about many things. I pulled back on the theology and philosophy that I had just studied in the universities, trying to give philosophical and theological reasons for the existence and the reality of sin and evil, but the answer didn't quite come there. I sat there and thought about a beautiful little daughter who had just been born about a month earlier. We have 4 children now, but we only had one then. She was the darling of my life. I'd come in night after night and see that little gentle smile. And I sat at that table thinking about that little girl and thinking about the fact that she could be taken away from any minute. And I started thinking about a dedicated, devoted, and loyal wife who was over there asleep. She could be taken from me, I could be taken from her. And I got to the point that I couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. And something said to me, "You can't call on Daddy now. He's up in Atlanta 175 miles away. You can't even call on Mama now. You got to call on that something and that person that your daddy used to tell you about. That power that can make a way out of no way." I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I never will forget it. Oh, yes, I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage." It seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world." I tell you, I've seen the lightning flash. I've heard the thunder roll. I've felt sin breakers dashing
trying to conquer my soul, but I heard the voice of Jesus saying, still to fight on. He promised never to leave me, never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me, never to leave me alone. Sometimes I feel discouraged. And I don't mind telling you this morning that sometimes I feel discouraged. I felt discouraged in Chicago. As I moved through Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama, I feel discouraged. Living every day under the threat of death, I feel discouraged sometimes. Living every day under extensive criticism, even from Negroes, I feel discouraged sometimes. Yes, sometimes I feel discouraged and feel my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. God bless you.
There's a moving speech. People forget Martin Luther King, first and foremost, was a Christian pastor at a Baptist church. His father was a Baptist preacher. I think his grandfather was. And the discouragement he had. I mean, look at the Selma to Montgomery march, where he was criticized after they parted the way at the bridge. Was it March 9th? Yeah, March 9th. And he knelt down with his crowd, and they turned around and went the other way, and other black leaders called him a coward. And he was setting the pace in the way to within 15 days of that for the Voting Rights Acts to be put in by Lyndon Johnson. Let's play another speech before we run out of time. This is the street sweeper speech. Martin Luther King at Laffey Radio today, April 9th, 1967, New Covenant Baptist Church in Chicago, by the preacher Martin Luther King.
What I'm saying to you this morning, my friend, even if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, go on out and sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures. Sweep streets like Handel and Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who swept his job well. If you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley, but be the best little scrub on the side of the reel. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. It isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are. And when you do this, you've mastered the length of life. This onward push to the end of self-fulfillment is the end of a person's life. Now, don't stop here, though. You know, a lot of people get no further in life than the length. They develop their inner powers. They do their jobs well. Do you know they try to live as if nobody else lives in the world but themselves? And they use everybody as mere tools to get to where they're going. They don't love anybody but themselves. And the only kind of love that they really have for other people is utilitarian love. You know, they just love people that they can use. A lot of people never get beyond the first dimension of life. They use other people as mere steps to which or by which they can climb to their goals and their ambitions. These people don't work out well in life. They may go for a while. They may think they're making it all right. But there is a law. They call it the law of gravitation in the physical universe. And it works. It's final. It's inexorable. Whatever goes up can come down. You shall reap what you sow. God has structured this universe that way. And he who goes through life not concerned about others will be a subject victim of this law. So I move on and say that it is necessary to add breath to length. Now, the breath of life is the outward concern for the welfare of others, as I said. And a man has not begun to live until he can rise above the narrow confines of his own individual concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity.
Wow. We're running a little behind. We'll take a late break here. It's Steve Laffey, Fixing America Radio with Martin Luther King. And if you got to be a street sweeper, be the best one you can be. What a great lesson. I'm going to play that tape again for my kids tonight. We'll be right back. Laffey Radio.
Stay tuned. Steve Laffey's Fixing America returns after these commercial messages.
I am an American soldier.
I'm a warrior and a member of a team.
I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values.
I will always place this first.
I will never accept defeat.
I will never accept defeat.
I will never quit.
I will never leave a fallen comrade.
I am disciplined.
I am disciplined.
Physically and mentally tough.
Trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills.
I always maintain my arms, my equipment, and myself.
I am an expert and I am a professional.
I stand ready to deploy, engage, and destroy the
enemies of the United States of America in close combat.
I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life.
I am an American soldier.
I am an American soldier.
I am an American soldier.
There's strong, and there's Army Strong. See what it takes at GoArmy.com.
Well, I finally did it. I opened a 401k.
What? Why? Just wait for the inheritance. We've definitely got a rich uncle somewhere. We're one call away from the winner's circle at the Derby, dinners with multiple forks, a vacation home in the country, using summer as a verb.
You don't actually think that, do you?
When it comes to financial stability, don't get left behind. Get tools and tips for saving at feedthepig.org. This message brought to you by the American Institute of CPAs, the Rhode Island Society of CPAs, and the Ad Council.
And now, back to the Fixing America radio program with your host, Steve Laffey.
Martin Luther King urged his crowd not to drink from the cup of bitterness, but to reach across the racial divide. Because, he said, we cannot walk alone. Their destiny is tied up with our destiny. Their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. He urged the victims of racial violence to meet white Americans with an outstretched hand, not a clenched fist. And in so doing, to prove the redeeming power of unearned suffering.
Wow, Steve Laffey, Laffey Radio special tribute. I'm moved listening to these speeches. You don't need to hear me speak. We're going to go right into another one where it's January 15, 2014, and we're going to continue to celebrate Martin Luther King's life and his advocacy for nonviolence and the changes he made. It's amazing. And we'll talk a little bit after this break. We're going to play a long speech now. This is the longest one. I'm sorry you don't know me speech. This is in Santa Rita Rehab Center up in California, January 14th of 68, in the year he would die. Listen to this one.
It was to see 3 of the prisoners at Santa Rita, Joan Baez, her mother, and Ira Sampo, incarcerated there for 45 days for their non-violent sit-in at the Oakland Induction Center late last month, that a very distinguished visitor appeared on Sunday afternoon, January 14th, a day of heavy, low, grey clouds and scatterings of rain. Despite this rain, a large crowd of sympathizers, a couple of hundred I'd say, had assembled about 50 yards down the narrow approach road from the entrance gate to greet Dr. Martin Luther King and demonstrate their support for Miss Baez and her fellow prisoners. After spending over an hour inside, Dr. King spoke to the vigilers outside.
Let me say how happy I am to see each of you here today, and I want to commend you for your willingness to engage in this vigil and stand in the midst of this rather inclement weather to express your support for all of those who have been arrested as a result of their courageous actions resisting the tragic, unfair, and unjust draft system of our nation. I've just had the opportunity of visiting my very dear friend Joan Baez, her mother, and our dear friend Ira Sandpearl. And they all send their greetings and their best wishes to you. And I might say they are in good spirits. You know, when you go to jail for a righteous cause, you can accept the inconveniences of jail with a kind of inner sense of calm and an inner sense of peace. And this is the way they are accepting that experience. Amen. They have supported us in a very real way in our struggle for civil rights, our struggle for freedom and human dignity all across the South. And I decided that in a way, or rather as an expression of my appreciation for what they are doing for the peace movement and for what they have done for the civil rights movement, I would take time out of my schedule to come out to see them, to visit them, and let them know that they have our absolute support. And I might say that I see these two struggles as one struggle. There can be peace. There can be no justice without peace, and there can be no peace without justice. People ask me from time to time, aren't you getting out of your field? Aren't you supposed to be working in civil rights? And they go on to say the two issues are not to be mixed. And my only answer is that I have been working too long and too hard now against segregated public accommodations to end up at this stage of my life segregating my moral concern. For I believe absolutely that justice is indivisible, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I want to make it very clear that I'm going to continue with all of my might, with all of my energy, and with all of my action to oppose that abominable, evil, unjust war in Vietnam. Now let me say this. I see some very dangerous trends developing in our country. Trends of oppression and repression and suppression. And I see a definite move on the part of the government to go all out now to silence dissenters and to try to crush the draft resistance movement. Now, we cannot allow this to happen, and we've got to make it clear. We've got to make it clear that to indict a Dr. Spock or to indict a Bill Coffin and the other courageous souls that have been indicted
will mean indicting all of us if they think that this draft resistance movement is going to be stopped.
There you go. Talk a little while.
And let us continue to work passionately and unrelentingly to end this cruel and senseless war in Vietnam. I don't have to go through all of the things that this war is doing to corrode the values of our nation. Suffice it to say that the war in Vietnam has all but torn up the Geneva Accord. It has strengthened the military-industrial complex of our nation. It has exacerbated the tensions between continents and races. And the war in Vietnam has placed our country in the position of being against the self-determination of the Vietnamese people. And then it has played havoc with our domestic destinies. And I can never forget the fact that we spend about $500,000 to kill every enemy soldier in Vietnam, and we spend only about $53 a year for every individual who is categorized as poverty-stricken in our so-called war against poverty, which isn't even a good skirmish against poverty. And I say that that is a great need for a revolution of values. And I say to you in conclusion, that we must continue to stand up, and we must continue to follow the dictates of our conscience, even if that means breaking unjust laws. Henry David Thoreau said in his essay on civil disobedience that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. And I do not plan to cooperate with evil at any point. Somebody said to me not too long ago, Dr. King, don't you think you're hurting your leadership by taking a stand against the war in Vietnam? Aren't people who once respected you going to lose respect for you? And aren't you hurting the budget of your organization? And I had to look at that person and say, I'm sorry, sir, you don't know me wrong by looking at the budget of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or by taking a Gallup poll of the majority opinion. Ultimately, a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but he's a molder of consensus. And on some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. And that is where I stand today, and that is where I hope you will continue to stand, so that we can speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters all over the world, and righteousness like a mighty stream. And we will speed up the day when men will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nations will not rise up against nations, neither will they study war anymore. And I close by saying, as we sing it in the old Negro spiritual, I ain't gonna study war no more.
Just tell us about your visit with Miss Maya.
Thanks for president. Yeah, they want that. Which way you want to go?
I'd like to find out something about his visit with Joe Biden.
We had a very, can you hear? I mean,
yeah,
that goes through in the music. We
We had a very fruitful visit with Miss Baez. The visit was mainly to express our support to her for her courage, for her willingness to stand up and face suffering and sacrifice in order to make it clear that the position of our administration is totally wrong in Vietnam, and in order to make it clear that war should cease and people of goodwill must work to bring about an end to war everywhere.
That was Martin Luther King. Did anybody ever hear a clearer definition of leadership? I don't think so. Moving me, I hope it's moving you. We'll be right back.
Stay tuned. Steve Laffey's Fixing America returns after these commercial messages.
Students, when I call the reason for your absences throughout the years, please exit the auditorium without your high school diploma. Too tired, family trip, sick day, starting the holidays early.
Starting in the 6th grade, students who miss 18 days or more of school in a year for any reason will fall behind and risk not graduating high school. How many days of school has your child missed this year? Absences add up. Keep track at boostattendance.org. Brought to you by the U.S. Army and the Ad Council.
The call to serve. It has no sound, yet I have heard it. In the whispered retelling of honorable sacrifices made by those who have served before me. The call to serve has no form, yet I have clearly seen it. In the eyes of men and women infinitely more courageous and more driven than most. The call to serve has no weight, yet I have held it in my hands. I will commit to carry it close to my heart until my country is safe and the anguish of those less fortunate has been soothed. The call to serve is at once invisible and always present. And for those who choose to answer the call, for their country, for their fellow man, for themselves, it is the most powerful force on earth. America's Navy, a global force for good.
And now, back to the Fixing America radio program with your host, Steve Laffey.
They came to the Washington Mall to honor Martin Luther King Jr., people of many different colors and backgrounds, the aging veterans of the civil rights movement, the president and his family.
That is why we honor this man, because he had faith in us.
It took 15 years from the time Congress approved it, nearly 2 years to build it, and a postponement because of a hurricane to this day.
I think it's so fitting and so appropriate to have on the front porch of America a monument to a man of peace.
Bernice King had just turned 5 years old when her father was killed.
This monument is a testament to the fact that the King legacy lives and will live on.
Steve Laffey's Fixing America. Thanks for joining us today. A special tribute to Martin Luther King, January 15th, 2014. We do this once in a while. It was John F. Kennedy, 50th year of his assassination, or Nelson Mandela passing. Christian pastor Martin Luther King set a tone unlike any others in the 1950s and 60s. And we're not going to get through all these clips, I don't think, but let's try to play this clip that, well, it's been I meant to the mountain clip. This is Memphis, Tennessee. Literally April 3rd, the day before he was shot.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Christian pastor, civil rights leader Martin Luther King. That's the day before he was shot, telling people he may not get there with him because he's up in heaven now, waiting for the other to come. But so much that he did. In fact, just before we play this last clip, we only have time to play a Bobby Kennedy speech, which is one of the most moving speeches as he hears about Martin Luther King being shot. And it's a matter of months before Bobby Kennedy is shot. But let's go back to Montgomery, 1955, just briefly. Brand new pastor comes in. He's a 25-year-old. Rosa Parks is not the first person to be arrested for sitting on a bus. In fact, Rosa Parks was not sitting in the white section of a bus. She was sitting in the front section of the black section. It got so crowded that the white men wanted to sit and make her get up, and she wouldn't. And for 382 days, he becomes the leader of They All Walk to Work and Boycott the Buses. And that's the beginning of the change. And the bravery shown by Rosa Parks and others. This Claudette Calvert, who they didn't use. She was 15 because she was pregnant. They didn't think she would be the right person to use as a test case. Let's play this last speech. We'll come back and close. This is Bobby Kennedy. This is after the shooting at the Lorraine Hotel, when Bobby Kennedy has to tell his followers what happened to Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1968.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks, and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. For those of you who are black, and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
That's Bobby Kennedy. It's a tough one for me to get through. Wisdom from the awesome grace of God. He talks about people want justice. That's why we celebrate Martin Luther. That's why we have these holidays. So I can play these tapes for my kids. So it's not just a day where you go out and shop. So we stop and remember. And that's why it's important that Martin Luther King Day became a national holiday. I remember the breakfast we had when I was the mayor, the 4 years I hosted, well, because I was in the same city, where the Urban League would have the big Martin Luther King breakfast. We should have played these tapes. Because the speeches I heard there had nothing to do with some of the stuff I hear from Martin Luther King, from the politicians who came up and just gave speeches, and some people not. Anyway. And we remember all the other people. Again, it's not about Jimmy Lee Jackson. I'll finish up with him. He's the guy who was shot by a state trooper in '65 that started the whole movement, the Selma to Montgomery marches, where Martin Luther King knelt and walked away, preaching nonviolence, and the Voting Rights Act came about. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old preacher, he died for this cause, as many did, and suffered and watched his father getting beat before he died. Anyway, God bless you. Have a great Martin Luther King Day. Remember, the struggle is not over. We'll be back with tomorrow. Laffey Radio, Steve Laffey's Fixing America. God bless
you. You've been listening to Steve Laffey's Fixing America radio program on the Laffey Radio Network. Fixing America is broadcast Monday through Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. right here at www.laffeyradio.com. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or account of this broadcast without the express written consent of Laffey Network, LLC is prohibited.